For nearly 1,000 years, Rome had been the center of the world. From this city, emperors ruled lands that stretched from the cold forests of Germania to the deserts of Africa. Armies marched out through its gates to conquer nations. Roads spread from its heart like arteries across an empire. Rome was not simply a city, it was the symbol of power itself. Marble temples towered above crowded streets. Aqueducts carried fresh mountain water across valleys and hills. Forums echoed with the voices of senators, merchants, soldiers, and citizens from every corner of the Mediterranean. People believed Rome would stand forever. They even had a name for it, the Eternal City. But in the 5th century, something unimaginable happened. The empire that once controlled the world had grown fragile. Political chaos shook the government. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession. Armies were no longer loyal to Rome, they were loyal to whoever paid them. And far beyond the borders of the empire, new forces were moving. Among them were the Goths. For generations, these dramatic tribes had lived near the frontiers of Rome. Sometimes they traded with the empire, sometimes they fought against it, sometimes they even served inside the Roman army. But the balance between Rome and the tribes was changing. Pressure from other migrating peoples pushed entire nations toward the Roman frontier. Vast groups of warriors, families, and chieftains began searching for land and security inside the weakening empire. At first, Rome tried to control them, then it tried to negotiate, but eventually Rome began to lose control. One of the most powerful Gothic leaders was a man named Alaric. He had once served within the Roman military system. He understood the empire, its strengths, but also its weaknesses, and he knew something few Romans were willing to admit. The empire was no longer invincible. In the year 408, tensions exploded. Political assassinations, betrayals, and broken promises pushed Alaric and his army toward a decision that would shock the ancient world. They marched on Rome. For centuries, the city had stood behind massive walls built by Emperor Aurelian. No enemy army had breached them in generations. Romans believed those walls made the city untouchable. But Alaric did not need to destroy the walls. He simply surrounded the city. The Gothic army cut off the roads. Food stopped arriving. Trade collapsed. The population of Rome, still hundreds of thousands of people, suddenly found itself trapped. Soon, hunger began to spread through the city. Ancient writers described desperate scenes. Markets stood empty. Families sold their possessions for scraps of grain. Some people fled the city if they could. Others stayed, hoping the crisis would pass. But the siege continued. Months passed. Inside the walls of Rome, fear slowly replaced confidence. Many citizens could hardly believe what was happening. This was Rome, the capital of an empire that had ruled the Mediterranean for centuries. Yet outside the walls stood an army that refused to leave. Negotiations began. Roman officials offered gold, silver, silk, and spices to convince the Goths to withdraw. Vast treasures were gathered from temples, palaces, and private homes. Alaric accepted the payment, but the deeper problems between Rome and the Gothic forces remained unresolved. Within 2 years, the situation returned to crisis. Once again, Alaric and his army approached the city, and this time the outcome would be far more devastating. In the summer of the year 410, the unimaginable finally happened. The gates of Rome were opened. Historians still debate exactly how it occurred. Some sources suggest that slaves inside the city secretly opened one of the gates during the night. Others claim Roman officials themselves made the decision when resistance became impossible. But when dawn approached, the Gothic army entered Rome. For the first time in nearly 800 years, a foreign army marched through the streets of the Eternal City. What followed was not the destruction of Rome in a single moment, but something perhaps even more haunting. For 3 days, the city was looted. Gothic warriors moved through the streets, breaking into houses, temples, and government buildings. Wealth accumulated over centuries disappeared in hours. Marble statues were torn down. Gold and silver vessels were carried away. The palaces of Roman nobles were stripped of their treasures. Yet this was not a mindless slaughter. Alaric had ordered his warriors to spare certain sacred places, particularly Christian churches. Many frightened citizens fled into basilicas and religious buildings, hoping they would be protected. Even so, the psychological shock was enormous. For centuries, Rome had been the center of civilization. Now, the world watched as the unthinkable unfolded. The eternal city had been breached, and nothing in the Roman imagination had prepared them for this moment. For 3 days, Rome was no longer the center of an empire. It was a city at the mercy of an invading army. The Gothic warriors moved through the streets in organized groups. They searched houses, palaces, and government buildings, carrying away whatever wealth they could find. Chests of coins were taken from noble homes. Silk garments from the East were pulled from storage rooms. Precious metal statues and ceremonial objects disappeared into the hands of soldiers who had grown up hearing stories about the riches of Rome. For many of them, this was the greatest city they had ever seen. Massive temples stood beside enormous public buildings. Marble columns lined the forums. Aqueducts still carried water across the hills. Even after centuries, the scale of Rome was overwhelming. But behind the beauty of the architecture, fear filled the streets. Families hid inside dark rooms, hoping the soldiers would pass by without breaking down their doors. Others fled toward churches and basilicas, believing those sacred spaces might offer protection. Ancient sources describe crowds gathering inside the great Christian churches, praying while chaos unfolded outside the walls. Some homes were looted quickly and left standing. Others were burned. Smoke began to rise above parts of the city as fires spread through districts filled with wooden roofs and crowded buildings. Narrow streets carried the sound of shouting, breaking stone, and collapsing structures. And yet, even during the sack, Rome was not destroyed completely. The Goths were not trying to erase the city from existence. They were taking its wealth. Alaric understood that the symbolic value of Rome was enormous. Destroying the city entirely would have sent a different message, one that might unite the empire against him. Instead, the sack of Rome demonstrated something far more powerful. It showed the world that Rome could be broken. For generations, Romans had believed their city was protected by destiny. Legends spoke of divine favor and eternal greatness. Even when enemies threatened the borders of the empire, people believed the heart of the Roman world would remain untouched. Now that illusion was gone. When the Gothic soldiers walked through the Roman Forum, they passed monuments built hundreds of years earlier, triumphal arches celebrating victories across the known world. Those arches still stood, but the empire that built them was already fading. In some districts, the damage was severe. The homes of wealthy senators were stripped of everything valuable. Storage buildings near the Tiber River were emptied. Large villas that once hosted banquets for the Roman elite were left silent and hollow. But the greatest impact was not the physical destruction. It was psychological. Across the Roman world, news of the sack spread quickly. Cities that had always looked to Rome as the center of order and power suddenly realized something had changed forever. If Rome itself could be invaded, then nowhere was truly safe. Some people believed the disaster had spiritual meaning. Christian thinkers of the time tried to explain the event to frightened believers. One of the most famous responses came from Augustine of Hippo, who wrote that earthly cities, even great ones like Rome, were never meant to last forever. Only the city of God was eternal. Meanwhile, the Goths prepared to leave. After 3 days of looting, Alaric ordered his army to move south through Italy. They carried enormous amounts of treasure with them, wealth that had been gathered in Rome over centuries of imperial rule. But something else had been taken as well: the illusion of Rome's invincibility. When the Gothic army finally marched away from the city, the streets of Rome were quiet. Smoke still rose from damaged districts. Broken doors and shattered statues lay scattered through once magnificent neighborhoods. Markets were empty. The great public spaces that once echoed with the voices of thousands were silent. Rome still stood. The temples were still there. The aqueducts still carried water. The great walls still surrounded the city. But the world understood something that had once seemed impossible. The eternal city had been conquered. In the years that followed, Rome would continue to decline. Political power shifted elsewhere. Emperors ruled from distant capitals. Populations shrank. Many of the grand buildings that once defined the city slowly fell into ruin. Nature and time began to reclaim what empire had built. Yet the memory of that moment in the year 410 never disappeared. For the first time in nearly 8 centuries, Rome had been breached. And in that moment, something fundamental changed in the story of the ancient world. The empire did not collapse overnight, but after the sack of Rome, everyone knew the same truth. The age of Roman dominance was coming to an end. The city that had once ruled the world was no longer untouchable, and the silence that settled over its streets would echo through history for centuries to come.